As we have thought about sacred words, that long vocabulary list of our faith, as we have pulled out our flashcards and reclaimed, redefined, and rediscovered many of them, we recognize that as we jot down all the words that go on that list of sacred words, there are some words we hesitate to write down. Not because we think they are unimportant, or because we want to intentionally diminish their significance. It's not even that we don't think they are sacred words, but it is because they are words that make us anxious or nervous, words that carry such meaning to them that they have a way of making us feel vulnerable, because within them is always not only the possibility, but the probability of change. And one of those words, which we might hesitate to talk about out loud in the middle of a church potluck, or even quietly amongst ourselves, is the word confession. Because the word confession holds such power to it, to turn our lives upside down, to make us feel vulnerable, to urge us, to nudge us towards changes in our lives. But confession is a sacred word because it can lead to forgiveness, justice, reconciliation. And those things we know are also sacred. When we say the word confession, it's good to be clear on what we are not saying, that we do not mean to confess to everyone. Now, whereas everyone is called to confession, we're not called to confess to everyone that we meet. Like that image of standing up in front of a congregation at the end of a worship service and feeling pushed or forced to admit some of our deepest, darkest regrets in our lives as we feel everyone staring at us in utter judgment. That when we say confession, that is not what we mean. We don't even necessarily refer to formal confession, although it is a valuable and important tradition where someone sits down to confess to a priest within the boundaries of confidentiality. That we don't necessarily mean formal confession. When we talk about confession, we mean first, confessing to God. And second, confessing to the person that we have harmed, injured, or wronged. The confession is admitting to our sin, acknowledging our mistake. And we share that with the person that we have hurt or harmed, and we share that with God. That at the very foundation, confession is the practice of honesty, of saying honestly what has taken place in our lives and in this world, which is the avenue towards forgiveness, justice, and reconciliation. And it is not easy to be honest with the person that we have harmed, wronged, or injured. And it is not even easy to be honest with God. But the person that it is absolutely the hardest to be honest with is ourselves. And if we cannot be honest with ourselves, we'll never be able to be honest with the person that we have wronged, or even honest with God. That it's hard to admit, even though we all make mistakes, that it's hard to admit that I have made a mistake. Now, there is such thing as too much honesty. That confession is not simply blind honesty. It needs to be done in a healthy, constructive manner for everyone who is involved. That honesty is not the same thing as oversharing. Jonathan Merritt recognizes that oversharing was the word of the year in 2014, named by Chambers Dictionary. It was a new claimed word, one that was all of a sudden used in widespread practice because of the different avenues of technology of sharing and conveying information and connecting with others. But confession is not the same thing as oversharing. Just conveying information is not the same thing as confessing a mistake. Because oversharing cannot lead to healing. It might lead to ratings, to gaining interest by others, to pique others' curiosity, but it doesn't lead to healing. That healthy vulnerability, healthy honesty is something different. As Brené Brown writes, vulnerability is about sharing our feelings and our experiences with people who have earned the right to hear them. So confession requires boundaries. It requires trust. It requires sensitivity. It requires accountability. That we do not confess just to anybody, but we confess in a way that can lead to healing for everyone involved. And it's not just about what was said or what was done. It's also about what motivated us, what fear drove us to say what was said or to do what was done. That it requires that hard work of self-awareness and self-reflection to really look in the mirror and think about why we did what we did or why we said what we said. That in confession we might explain that we were afraid of what others might think, so we lashed out in order to look strong instead of weak. Or we might need to admit that we were jealous, so we grabbed for something for ourselves instead of thinking about the needs of others. Or we might admit that we spoke harshly in judgment of somebody else because we felt judged ourselves. That it takes time to understand why we have done what we have done. And it takes strength to step into the vulnerability that goes along with confession. Jonathan Merritt reminds us that confession is both an end and a means to an end. That it is an end because in confession, when done properly, we find relief. We have a peace of mind. There is a release of that weight that was bearing down on our shoulders. But that's not the only thing we find in confession. It's also a means to an end. That beyond those things, it can open the door to a new reality, to the possibility of forgiveness, to the chance of reconciliation, to the hope of liberation. That confession can become the steps on the journey to all of those things. So, even though it makes us anxious, we should write down confession on that long list of vocabulary words of our faith, and to learn how to talk about it, and even how to do it with the same sacred purpose that we find in that very word. For it can lead us into a new reality for the benefit of others and even ourselves. Amen.